Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events here at the IDA. Thank you, as always, for joining us. Before we get started, I would like to offer just a brief land acknowledgement. I'm coming to you today from Chicago, as you can tell. It's a little bit chilly here today. It is on the unceded land of the Potawatomi people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would also like to thank IndieWire for their support in bringing the screening series to y'all this year. And we have a few more screenings coming up through December 10th. So you can check them out at documentary.org/screening-series. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Christy Lemire for this conversation around the documentary Wojnarowicz.
Hi, everyone. So great to see you. Thanks for tuning in and hanging out with us. I am Christy Lemire from RogerEbert.com and the Breakfast All Day podcast. And I'm thrilled to be here with the director of Wojnarowicz, Chris McKim, and producer Fenton Bailey. Good to see you guys.
Hi. Good to see
Hello,
you.
hello. So Chris, we were talking a little bit before we began here about the archive, the trove of information that you got about Wojnarowicz's life. How did you first get access to that?
Well, it all really started with the estate and getting sort of their backing and approval to do the documentary at all, so that I would have access to that and David's work and art and all of that. Fortunately, his archive was all kept at NYU. After he passed away, their Fales Library has this huge sort of downtown collection. And so they had, I think, nearly 200 audio cassettes that were David's tape journals and the answering machine tapes, band rehearsals. And so some of that had been digitized. They started sending it to me, and each file was like a half hour to 45 minutes. It was like one half of an audio cassette. And some of it was like loosely labeled and some of it was not, but we really didn't have any idea what was on any of the stuff. So the first thing I did was load up the files on my iPhone and just started walking around, like listening to David and discovering what was on the tapes long before we started editing. And, for me, it really turned it into a very personal process because I spent so much time with David in my head, sharing his stories, things that he was only telling himself, on these journals. So it became sort of really quite intimate. And then beyond the audio, they had, I think, over 500 contact sheets of his photographs, which sort of totaled, I guess, over 10,000 images by the time you sort of, rows of negatives on the contact sheet. So we had all of that in his journals and basically everything that was in his apartment when he passed away. And much of it he had been carting around for a good part of his life, was all there. And so once the estate was on board, we sort of had carte blanche to dive in and do what we wanted.
That sounds overwhelming. That sounds like a lot of material to get through.
It was a lot, but it was really all guided by the story. First David's audio and then the interviews that I did, so that as we were editing, I would start sort of doing string outs of little sections, just using the audio and really telling the story through each of these pods. And then I would hand that section off to the editor, Dave Stanky, sometimes with images on and, whether it was from the Super 8 film or whatever it might be, starting to put some things on. Sometimes I did not know what to put over and I would sort of hand it off to him, because then I would jump to the next section to try to stay ahead of him as he would do like that initial rough cut with the visuals and kind of trim down and move around some of the things I had laid out. So it was a lot of stuff, but there was sort of a process. There were certainly things that, I may have had for 2 years and didn't discover until very late in the process, like the answer machine, or I'm sorry, when David recorded the conversation with his brother, the big fight they have, and he had recorded his half of the conversation. Now, I knew about that fight. I had already interviewed Stephen, his brother, and he had talked about that. And I had no idea that David had his half of the conversation. And that was something that very, very late, you know, in the process, I sort of discovered in our massive material. And, you know, it was quite powerful because I could hear, you know, you can hear David's emotion towards things that I think everyone, you know, at least in the queer community, in terms of dealing with his sexuality and family, and because he had already been diagnosed with AIDS, the way it affected him, you could hear in his voice, which sounded very relatable. And at the same time, I was a little gleeful to have this material that, you know, I just hadn't anticipated.
That's amazing that he had the presence of mind. His brother had the presence of mind to record his side of it. I wonder why he did that.
Well, no, David recorded his side, and
Oh, I
I
see.
had already,
Oh, I see.
Stephen had told me about the fight. It was sort of, because that was the last time they ever spoke. So he's carried this with him for 30 years. You know, it's a big part of his life. And so he had told me about it, and that was the last time they ever spoke.
I see. So it was a corroboration of that anecdote. I see.
Exactly, yeah. And, you know, it was unusual that there weren't too many instances of all those tapes. There weren't very many instances where David recorded the phone conversations in that way, or, you know, his half of the conversation. It was much more intimate tape journal stuff and that kind of thing, but not that type of conversation.
You mentioned that you were walking around New York with David's recordings in your head. What kind of mood did that put you in? Because a lot of it's not terribly soothing. A lot of it's rageful, or it's very deeply personal. How did that make you feel? How did that change your mood for the day?
Well, I mean, you know, David carried all, you know, had carried a range of emotions in it. Mm-hmm. So like, while some of the material was deep and dark, it was, you know, it was certainly surrounded by other observations he had in his life. So it wasn't necessarily, the process wasn't necessarily wall-to-wall sort of torture in that way. And because I didn't know, you know, what was on the tapes, when I put them on the iPhone, I just hit shuffle. So I would go from like an answering machine, like a half hour of an answering machine tape, which we wouldn't know what year it was. So we were kind of trying to Nancy Drew, like listening for little clues to, you know, figure out like, oh, this is 85, or, you know, this is 84, and try to find ways that, you know, find out how it fit into the story, or in the character development, such as with like Peter and his sister.
And then Fenton, at what point do you come in the process while he's assembling all this? When do you step in to produce the film?
Well, you know, Chris knew exactly what he wanted to do. And we had sort of finished a film like maybe a year or so earlier about Robert Mapplethorpe. And Chris came to us about, you know, talking about Wojnarowicz. And what was so interesting to us about doing it was that they were such opposites, and yet they were, you know, they were contemporaries of each other. They were East Village, you know, they were artists in the East Village in the 80s, and they just seemed so different. And we had sort of, we never met Wojnarowicz, we never met him. We actually, Randy and I had a band, the Pop-Tarts, the fabulous Pop-Tarts, I should say. And so we'd be on the same bill sometimes as Three Teens Kill Four, and we'd play at the Pyramid. So we knew of him. Of course, we saw his graffiti, the burning house. We saw it around town. So in some ways, it was a very personal story. And also we knew PPOW, the gallery that represent all his work. So it was kind of a personal thing to do. And it just, having done Mapplethorpe, who was such a different polar opposite kind of artist, you know, Mapplethorpe was very precise and pristine, and Wojnarowicz was like just this volcano of stuff. And Wojnarowicz's image was always sort of perfect and very precise and black and white, and Wojnarowicz was just like this multimedia artist. It just seemed just a completely irresistible project. So we basically, long story short, we came in and just said, have at it. You know, we just paid for it. That's basically what we did. I mean, because Chris did a fantastic job. I mean, it is such a, seeing that first cut, it was so powerful. And it was, what I loved about it was just so much that, you know, you feel Wojnarowicz is there with you in the room. You know, you're really immersively experiencing him. Mm-hmm. And that was a little bit like Mapplethorpe too, because we had all these cassettes and interviews of Mapplethorpe. So I sort of see these as sort of brother and sister twin docs, although I really love Wojnarowicz. It's really great.
Yeah. What was it like to be in New York around the time and be in those same kinds of circles? What was his reputation like? What was his energy like?
Oh my gosh. I mean, he was a firebrand, and he, with his diagnosis, everything that sort of the rage and anger. I mean, I suppose in a way, he was the angriest at the time. No, he really was. And he was such a key part of ACT UP. And that, I think that rage I think when ACT UP founded, it found a voice for that rage and that frustration with the government. But until that point, I think he was sort of somewhat of an outsider. And I think, Chris, I don't know if you agree, but I think that rage even today, like, makes people step back a little bit. They still find it a little bit frightening, right? Do you think?
Probably. I know certainly the people that knew him, I think, carried that with them. And I was certainly afraid through the whole process that, if I sort of went astray, that he would come back and haunt me, which was like a legitimate, concern. But, luckily he was by our side, helping us all along the way.
And Chris, how much did you know about him and his life prior to embarking on this project?
I knew, compared to what I came to know, virtually nothing. I knew very little. Like, I was familiar with the Rimbaud photos and some of the paintings. I knew that, some of the essays and his book, Close to the Knives. But when the project came up, it was like July 2017. And at the time, we were 6 months into the new administration. And I personally was, losing my mind a little, as I think a lot of people were, and trying to find something that would make me feel better about, how I was spending my time, and trying to find a project that would somehow, help me feel better just about what was going on. And at the time, I sort of stumbled across David again, and I realized that there was all this story on top of, what little I did know about him. And at that point, it was about, I guess, a year before the Whitney retrospective. So it was sort of a perfect time to reach out to his estate in PPOW. And then as soon as I had reached out to the estate is really when I talked to Randy and Fenton, and was like, oh, I'm talking to these folks, and what would you think? And, fortunately, they were game.
What surprised you the most as you got to know him and about his background and his story and his work? What surprised you the most along the way?
For me, it was just, I was happy that we had access to a full personality. Going into the project, I knew that there was audio available, but I didn't know what exactly there would be. I knew he had all the writing. And so really at the start, I anticipated having to do, the film I'm Not Your Negro was a big influence early on coming in. And I really anticipated having to kind of like split the difference between like using what little audio I thought I could get from David, and then really mining his writing and having that voice to kind of fulfill that. So the fact that there was so much personal material, and there was really this opportunity to kind of help bring him to life, I think was the biggest surprise. And really that was the reason why all the interviews, we ended up doing them off camera, because rather than seeing folks 30 and 40 years after they knew David throughout the documentary, I thought, by keeping their likenesses at the time they knew him, and not seeing sort of the years that have gone by throughout the documentary as they were talking about him, created an opportunity to really, let David live as much as anyone else that was speaking in the film.
And then to see a lot of those folks at the very end is quite moving, right? The ones who are still around and could go to that Whitney retrospective, and they're so moved. It's hard not to be moved as well. So it sounds like you knew pretty early on that you wanted to approach this with sort of a pastiche aesthetic, correct?
Yeah. For sure. And as I said, even before I really kind of knew what was there. And then, the other thing, David's art is really complicated. And it was one of the biggest challenges, I think, throughout, because, talking about Mapplethorpe or Keith Haring, who, David worked with at Danceterian, was also contemporary. You see a Keith Haring regardless of what it is. And you're like, oh, that's a Keith Haring.
Mm-hmm.
You see, you know, like you see a Mapplethorpe, it's like, oh yeah, fisting, that's a Maple. You can tell a Mapplethorpe. And with David's work, I mean, if you're aware of the types of stuff he does, you might know what it is, but even, you know, in a gallery, you kind of have to sit there and stare at it because it's so complicated and it's a collage of all these things and ideas, you know, sort of colliding all at once, that it really, you know, the challenge was how to make a film about an artist without having the opportunity to really stare at individual pieces in the way you might normally be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
I see you nodding there. Can you expand on that, please?
Well, yeah, no, I was just thinking that I think what's so interesting about Wojnarowicz is that I sort of see him as a documentary artist. You know, he documented so much, and I love the answering machine cassettes and, you know, the diaries and the tapes he made. And in a way, he sort of makes me feel a bit like Warhol. And even, I guess, Keith Haring and even Mapplethorpe, they're all documenting their lives and the world around them. And I see them as this school of documentary artists. But Wojnarowicz especially, and I love the way Chris like collaged everything together, because that was very much that is his voice. It's this sort of bombardment from all angles in different ways.
So why?
I mean, one of the, I was just going to say I think one of the things that Chris and I really worked together most on was coming up with the title for the film, because there were all these titles. Like, Chris, what were some of the other titles? And
they were all various pieces of, you know, trying to find stuff from his work. You know, there were different essay titles and different art piece titles, but nothing as catchy as Fuck You Faggot Fucker.
And it is catchy, and it's very arresting and slightly shocking and slightly sort of outrageous. But I love that story in the film of how this was the title of a collage he had made. And even when they were first showing it in the gallery, the gallerist was like, we can't call it that. And Wojnarowicz was like, no, that's what it's called. And and that, you know, the very idea that the title he found on a scrap of paper on the street is just speaks volumes about what a kind of documentarian he was.
Yeah.
Chris, thank you for saying the full title of the film for me. I appreciate you doing that for me.
You can't really say it with asterisks, can you?
No.
You can go F-U, F-F.
Yeah.
Well,
and it's implied.
And, you know, and why it's funny because, like, while no one ever told, because as soon as it came up, you know, Fenton was like, yes. And Randy was like, maybe we should think about it a second. And then the next morning he was like, let's do it. And Kino, you know, no one had ever said don't use the title, but they certainly don't always use the title, you know, for various concerns, you know, I think legitimate concerns about it getting kicked off and stuff. And then suddenly, you know, 9 months after the film comes out, Dan Levy literally wears the piece of art, Fuck You Faggot Fucker, on the Met Gala red carpet, and it's in like People magazine without the asterisks.
Oh, they spelled it out?
I don't know if lots of different magazines were like, you know, like lots of different outlets that we were afraid of were suddenly,
What did you think when you saw him wearing that shirt?
I mean, I was thrilled, but I will say that it was controversial. And, you know, I spoke to Wendy Olsoff from PPOW the next day, and you know, the gallery manages the estate for them, and they were, you know, very involved in that. And, you know, people are very protective, and they were involved with that decision, so they were, you know, fully aware of that. But, you know, people are very protective of David's work and what it means. And I think to a lot of people, you know, especially like, you know, aging punks or people that like, you know, really live that sort of aesthetic and point of view, weren't so keen on it. But at the same time, you know, the day after the Met Gala was David's birthday, and more people were saying his name than would have otherwise. And, you know, and I think the other thing in the film, you know, David says when we put ourselves in our work, you know, speaking about, as he says, you know, culture with a capital C, we apply this tiny amount of pressure against a system of control that would willingly jump into fascism if there wasn't enough pressure on its throat. And to me, that's a perfect example. And it might be gaudy, And maybe it's something that David wouldn't have approved of. But at the same time, if David was still alive, he would have been keeping his name in, you know, people's mouths for 30 years. And there's a challenge to that.
So long before he was diagnosed with AIDS, he, for a long time, had this like voracious need to document everything, as you say, Fenton. Where does that drive come from, do you think?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, I think that the maybe this is a slightly pretentious answer, but I just think that sort of the drive to document things is a very well, I mean, artists are always documenting, aren't they? But it just feels that like we are in an age of documentation. I mean, I think about Warhol just keeping everything and putting it in those time capsules, and I just think maybe for the first time culturally, we're able to practically keep everything. And so it's, you know, he also was around the same time as Nelson Sullivan, whose work is also in this, it's the Fales Library, right, Chris? Is it Fales?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
His work is, and Nelson around in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, he was around New York, East Village, videotaping everything. He was out every night videotaping everything and everyone. I don't know how to account for it, but there was this sort of period of, let's call them slightly obsessive documenters, you know. I mean, and funny enough, even Mapplethorpe said, you know, the pictures I'm making are really just documentary of the life that I'm living. And so hey, Chris, do you have any idea?
Well, I mean, I think for David, part of it was proving to himself that he had gone through these experiences and figuring out these, you know, parts of his life and things he had experienced. But even, you know, the most intimate tape journals ended up in 3 Teens Kill 4 songs. Like, he always used that material. And there are songs like Desire and Stay and Fight, which Stay and Fight is entirely made up of elements from David's, it was a mixtape that he made in Paris for friends. But, you know, I think he always found ways to incorporate it and not just use things once. He would, you know, reuse ideas and try things out in different ways. And essays would be in catalogs, or then parts of it would be used in paintings. And, you know, in that way, it kind of felt like this process was a collaboration, because any of the stuff we used were things that had David stuck around, he either had used in some way, or, you know, had he lived longer, he most definitely would have reused in some other way. And so all of this stuff was sort of fodder for the work. And even in the film at the beginning, you know, that one of the few sort of sync verite scenes that we have, and he's there with Phil Zwickler, who you don't see because he's filming it. And David gets off the phone after speaking to a reporter and says, you know, oh, I should have been recording that. And he's like, oh, you were going to record it and use it in your art. And he's like, yeah.
But Fenton, you make a really good point about how people are documenting everything all the time now through Instagram or TikTok, and it's all the like banal minutia of their lives or whatever. But it seemed like he felt like there was a purpose to what he was shining a light on, right? There's a purpose to who he was shining a light on, people on the fringes, people who were suffering, people who were, you know, overlooked or forgotten. Absolutely. And I wonder where that comes from.
Well, I think this is what made the film. So when Chris came up with the idea to make the film, why it was bizarrely perfect timing. I mean, I don't know that Chris predicted the pandemic, but it's extraordinary that, you know, Wojnarowicz was living at a time under Reagan with the AIDS epidemic and never mentioned AIDS for many, many years. And there was a feeling of carelessness on the part of the government and a refusal to engage with it. And yet here we are, you know, Chris just finished his film and the world goes into a lockdown with another pandemic, with another Republican right-wing president who also doesn't really care about people getting this illness and dying of this illness, with the result that, you know, 500,000+ people in the States alone have died. So it's an extraordinary parallel time. And I think that Chris sort of honors this voice that was prophetic in its day, and everything that David's voice had to say then is still chillingly relevant to today. Chris will correct me, but I think Wojnarowicz said several times, talked about one tribe nation and his belief that minorities, whether it's people of color, whether it's gay people, are sort of seen by the government as expendable. And that the one tribe is the sort of white patriarchy. And wow, I mean, he nailed it then, and it's just as relevant and urgent now. So Chris, thank you for making this film, because
Thank you. Well, and it's, talking about finishing the film, we were racing to finish the film for Tribeca April 2020, and we did the final mix of the film the week of March 13th, the week everything shut down. And so it was really, lots of fine tuning with the online had to be done, but we really couldn't change anything after that because the mix had been done. And cut to a year later and the film's coming out. And David, of course, is talking about, if I were a violent person, I'd storm the Capitol and attack the politicians. But he knew that it was like, those aren't the people, it's like, yeah, you want to go after those people. But the fact is, it's the system that is problematic. And and just as he talked about one tribe nation, with that, he really spoke about the pre-invented existence we kind of get from this, the way the racism and the corruption and the manipulation is baked into the system. And I think, making it at this particular time, it's, while Trump was in office the entire time as we were making it, it was like glaringly obvious. But the fact is, it's never been not a problem, it's less apparent sometimes.
Right.
Though it may never be less apparent again, which is good, until it changes.
Right. I mean, because funnily enough, I think Randy and I thought that when we came on board that it would be we didn't think it would be difficult to find funding for the film, but it was completely impossible. And I was sort of surprised by that, but I suppose in a way, he's not radical, he's just speaking the truth. But I guess the truths he's speaking are uncomfortable. And even to this day, to an establishment, even the documentary establishment, that we went to all the places you would go to get funding, nothing. And I think that there is a sort of, I don't know what it is, but maybe just the almost the unacceptable face of his rage is seen as sort of somehow, maybe it cuts too close to home or something, because finding the financing for Mapplethorpe was the easiest, quickest thing that ever happened in my life. In complete contrast, Wojnarowicz, nothing. But we were like, there was no question that we weren't going to make the film, but it was just interesting that, we had to do it on our own dime.
That's unfortunate. And it's also interesting timing wise, because there was this big retrospective at the Whitney. And so you think like his name's on people's lips, and so why not jump on that, train as it's going along? That's really strange that that was hard to sell.
Well, I just think he resisted any kind of commodification. And that's what I love about him. I mean, I know he would love this film, Chris. I'm pretty sure he'd love this film. But do you know what I mean? He, like when he got the opportunity to do this fabulous installation in the basement of some uptown house, the Manutians, whose son was a Treasury secretary, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And rodents and cockroaches. I mean, oh my God, what a punk, right?
Well, that's also an interesting tie to the Trump administration, that there's, Mnuchin's parents had his work in their house. I was going to ask you, what do you think he would have made of the big Whitney tribute? Because it was such a fascinating contradiction about him, that he was putting out art that was urgent and needed to be seen. And yet when there's an opportunity to show it in a more mainstream setting, he balked at that. What would he have made of the 2018 show, do you think?
Based on its merits, I would not say. I think it's amazing that the work was there. I know a lot of people, again, like with the Dan Levy red carpet thing, people had issues with the way the art was displayed and that sort of thing. But, David, while he really did not like the institutions, also understood the importance of them. His relationship with Peter Hujar. When Peter Hujar died, nobody knew who Peter was. And the first thing David did was try to get Peter's work in the MoMA, you know, in New York, or the Met, one of those, because he understood that even though, you know, art is made by certain people for certain people, and who's keeping track of history, to change that, you know, you need to kind of break into those institutions. So, you know, I'm sure David would have had, and this is putting it kindly, notes on the thing, but I think, you know, you don't want these things to be, you know, reviews and nominations and all these things. You know, you don't want to be validated by these things, because there is more to life, and it is about, you know, what the work means and what it's trying to say. But at the same time, if no one sees it, if it's not getting out there, it doesn't have the impact, and it can't just be held on to, you know, the small tribes alone and make a difference. It's certainly not in the world we have now.
I'm glad you mentioned Peter Hujar. I wanted to get to him at some point. How do the two of them influence, improve, challenge each other over the years, do you think?
Well, Peter certainly, I think, helped, you know, he, in that sort of Mapplethorpe way, you know, Peter's art was very precise, and you see Peter's photos, and, you know, like, you can tell it's you know, it's very meticulous in a way, where Carla McCormick talks about, who's in the film, talks about David's aesthetic being this sort of like East Village kind of shabby chic kind of, like, you know, there's this messiness to it, but as, you know, through some of, you know, his time with Peter, one of the things that kind of rubbed off was this attention to detail in ways that you can see in some of the photographs, and certainly in the paintings that he did later in life, in the Sex series, which is this sort of negative image thing that caused all the controversies. And, you know, in reverses, as I said, David really helped Peter as much, because even in their lifetimes, David became more famous before he was not, you know, the it boy for a while. But like in '85 and all that stuff, he did have a level of fame, and he did try to, you know, as much of it as he could stomach, he tried to spread that around and try to help other people that he knew, other artists, whether it was the money that was coming in or the attention he was getting. And David was also, you know, they were both, as Fran Lebowitz talks about in the film, they both had horrible childhoods and, you know, were sort of damaged souls. And yet David was a much more social person, and he was much more, had many more collaborators and friends, and he kept them all compartmentalized. But that energy was something that Peter did not have, and probably helped him as well.
Yeah, brought him out of his shell a little bit, maybe. Do you guys have a particular favorite piece of his, or one piece that's like the most necessary and vital? What would each of you pick among his large collection of work he did over the years?
I love the collaboration that he did. It's a self-portrait collaboration. It's actually, we were fortunate enough to use it for the poster, but it's, you know, it's a photograph of David that a friend of his, Tom Warren, took, that David then painted the flames on, and added the collage of the maps, because maps were always a big part of his work, because he believed that, like, it, you know, it sort of talked, it spoke to the way art can sort of break through, you know, country borders and that sort of thing. And there were other elements on it that, you know, reflected David's other work. But it is one of those pieces that you see, and it's just so stunning and clear, and, you know, it's really gripping. And to see him in it so clearly, I thought is very powerful. And it was also the first image when you walked into the Whitney Gallery. It was, as soon as the elevators opened, it was right there.
What about you, Fenton? What do you think?
I mean, I love the work more as a totality than necessarily like focusing on individual pieces. I mean, I do love the painting "Fuck You, Faggot, Fucker." I really think it's astonishing. It's just astonishing. But I also love the film he did. Karen Finley's in it. I forget what it's called. It's like,
Richard, yeah. You Killed Me First, directed by Richard Kern. They kind of schemed together.
It's marvelously unhinged and melodramatic, but also, and I would say in a way like sort of John Waters-esque, you know, like it's almost camp, but it's also really shocking and disturbing at the same time, which, you know, sometimes I think camp doesn't always pull that off, you know. And he's just so good in it, and I just love that. I wish and also I love it too because it just speaks to you know, you asked what was it like living in the East Village at that time. That film is most what it was like living in the East Village at that time. It just sort of the whole vibe and feel of it, you know, because I think it was, in many ways, it was a scene that was very like do it yourself and punk. Not just in a fuck the establishment sort of way, but punk in the sense of like making something out of nothing. And I think that's, I guess, again, why I just love the film Chris has made, because it sort of honors that whole sort of do-it-yourself spirit and that just energy of just doing it, you know?
Is the film you're referring to, is it the one where they recreate his childhood at the dining room table with the bunny rabbit?
Yes.
Yeah.
That is messed up, yeah.
Yeah, the whole point of that was they wanted to see what made the punks the way they were. You know, that was sort of like how they want to do it, and they channeled their own lives.
Yeah, as ugly and pure as it is. Is there anybody working today that channels this spirit that you guys can think of? Or is there anyone he's influenced so much that like you see, aha, that's the Wojnarowicz in this person?
I don't know that I'm qualified to say. I'm so not of the art world that, you know, I'm sure if I poked around, I'd be like, oh yes, that. But you know, certainly, I mean, I think just about any queer artist working, you know, in some way, and even looking at film, David was so influential in the new queer cinema, which was just starting out as David passed away in the early 90s. Things like My Own Private Idaho and Drugstore Cowboy and you know, Greg Araki films and such. They carried that sort of very queer punk aesthetic and, you know, put it out to the public in a way that people had not really seen before, didn't have access to films in that way. You know, they were considered more underground, and they were becoming, you know, more mainstream, not because they were being softened, but because they were being seen.
I suppose this is a bit random. I suppose I see a little bit of Wojnarowicz in Lil Nas X. Like completely queer, completely unapologetic, and kind of if you don't like it, you can fuck off. But of course, you know, Lil Nas X is existing within the lanes of commodification, which I suppose really any artist today has to do, right? It's very hard for them to exist. I'm not saying it was easy for Wojnarowicz to do what he did, but there was a time when artists were still seen as real outsiders, I suppose, and could do their work outside of any system. And I think that is harder to do now, you know, because you say, well, who would it be today? It'd probably be someone we've never heard of or never come across or never seen, right? But the closest, I think, energy-wise is Lil Nas X. What Chris, do you agree with that? Or do you think that's just way off base?
No, I mean, that does make sense to me. You know, and I think, you know, it's interesting, like for all the evils of Instagram, that oddly is like one of the best places to find like these underground artists and people. One of the good things about a site like that and a platform like that is like when the art isn't being censored, you do actually have an opportunity, although more and more it's being taken down, which is probably why Keena was worried about fuck you faggot fucker. But you know, it's like it is, you know, there are opportunities to come across these artists who I think, you know, grew up with David's work and grew up with David's writing, I think more than anything. And as Fran was saying, it really is kind of the totality. It was the life he lived and the way all of the art reflects that life and the world that, you know, he encountered.
Well, I love both your answers because I think Gus Van Sant and Lil Nas X are totally singular. and unlike anybody else out there. So that's a fantastic analogy. We have to wrap. I'm so sorry to go, but I've loved chatting with you folks. Thank you so much, Chris and Fenton, for talking to me, and thanks to the great folks at IDA, and thanks to all of you for watching. Appreciate it.
Just before we go, I do
Yeah,
have to say
please.
thank you to the IDA, because the support of this film from the IDA is absolutely incredible, and it means such a lot, especially where it is, I think, hard. We're in a golden age of documentaries, yes, but there are a lot of stories that don't get told and don't get financed and don't get made. And I think the support of IDA of this film, that exists outside of the world of corporate finance is really just so special and touching and much appreciated.
Indeed. I'm glad this eye-opening film is out there for the world. So thanks to IDA. All right. Thanks, you guys.
Yes,
have a
very
great
much so.
day. Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.